Afghanistan is normally considered to be the graveyard of empires, and when we talk about Afghanistan, it's always in these terms. And indeed, historical legacies are often used to dismiss any kind of intervention. I'm not a neoconservative. I don't believe in ideological interventions for specific moral or ideological outcomes. But in the great game, since the dawn of time, the best defence has always been the best offence. It's like, to use a profane football analogy, to be an isolationist is to place all of your defenders on the goal line and let the opposition strike shots at the goal. Of course, in football, as in international strategy or in chess or in any game of strategy, ultimately you have to try and dominate the space, and that involves some kind of active participation in the world. The idea that we can just retreat into an isolationist mode is more of an imperial nostalgia than believing that to preserve security in global order and to pursue your own interests in the world, you have to in some way engage with it. Perhaps one of Britain's high points was during Lord Salisbury's, quote, splendid isolation, where we took a back seat from the world, where the British Empire decided that it wasn't going to be in an expansionary mode, but in a mode of consolidation. Or to even go back to the ancient empire that everybody compares everything to, often incorrectly, and I'm sure this is not a perfect example, the Roman Empire, in the five good emperors. The idea that it was a period of peace and prosperity because it consolidated itself, and it was effectively isolationist. But, of course, Lord Salisbury and the British Empire at that time had the privilege of being isolationist because they dominated the world. Right? That the Romans had the privilege of being isolationist because they dominated the world. But that is not the case today. Today it's the American Empire that dominates the world. And this withdrawal from Afghanistan is a vacuum that other governments will fill. And one of the reasons for this is the mode in which the coalition presence was held in Afghanistan. And this is the lesson of history that we get from Afghanistan, coming from a great work of history by Adam Tooze called The Deluge, The Great War and the Remaking of the Global Order. And there's a section in this book where he outlines how, indeed, Churchill, of all people, ironically enough, managed to control insurgencies in the Middle East with technological superiority. So here's the quote. In Britain too, as debt service and social spending rose, and as budgets plunged, it was military spending that was targeted. So after the First World War, you have a huge reduction in spending, partly because the British were under the illusions that they were going to share naval hegemony with the Americans, which of course never happened. I mean, one of the first wars that the Americans ever fought as an independent nation was against the Ottomans. It was effectively a naval war. So the idea that the British were going to have half of the world for their navy and Americans would have half was a delusion that the Americans didn't even entertain at the time. So the result of the war was that naval spending and all military spending in the UK would have to be cut. So the first round of these cuts came in April 1919, and they reduced military spending from 400 million to under 100 million. Sir Henry Wilson, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, who'd once deployed huge armies, found himself juggling battalions between Ireland, the Rhineland and Persia to chase one emergency after another. Britain, of course, looked to its empire and its colonial possessions to make a contribution, but attempts to offload the cost of the Imperial Army on India was met with extreme resistance. And this comes to the main point. In the Middle East, Britain's infamous policy of, quote, policing insurgencies by means of aerial bombardment was adopted overall because it was cheap. The initial estimate for the military garrison of the Iraq Mandate had run to 30 battalions at a cost of 30 million. After the Cairo Conference of March 1921, Winston Churchill decided he could manage with a budget of only 10 million, so long as 4 infantry battalions based in Baghdad could be backed up by 8 squadrons of bombers. These bombers could be had for as little as £3,000 apiece. So 100 years ago, almost to the year 1921, you have a situation where a contraction in military spending and a lack perhaps of ambition and desire to project imperial power led the British military to transform its composition of force in this region from being mainly an infantry force into a combined infantry and air force, where the air superiority would allow for the policing of the insurgencies. Now, this was a policy that was used in Afghanistan for the last few years, and it worked in the sense that the ANA and the Afghan government was able to hold on despite all of its corruptions, of course. And while a lot has been said about these ghost regiments, you have to remember that that type of corruption was endemic in the British Army all the way up until the 20th century. And despite that, it still was a functioning state and a functioning military power. Now, this doesn't mean that everything in Afghanistan was perfect and there weren't flaws. The point is that the current military presence had a precedent in imperial history, that the Americans, like the British, could reduce their military spending, or at least reduce their spending in that region, by transforming their composition to one based mainly around air support. And this is something the Americans did. Of course, Biden decided to pull out without even consulting the British, which is a bit of an insult. But ultimately, it was a negation of this tried and tested theory of control, which means that despite what people might argue, that we didn't leave Afghanistan because it was too expensive, we didn't leave Afghanistan because it was too costly in terms of material and lives, but we left Afghanistan for political purposes. And whether you support that or not, it's 20 years of policy down the drain, effectively. And it isn't a huge cost to project power into Afghanistan, and it allows a foothold against China, and of course there are lots of radar bases and things that were put in Afghanistan in order to spy on China, and it also was a foothold for the neocons to go into Iran eventually. But the main point of this is that we can't consider the Afghan withdrawal as being cost effective, as being a strategic victory. Of course, it's a strategic failure. It's an enormous failure, and that is one of the lessons of history that we're going to have from Afghanistan. It's not necessarily that it's the graveyard of empires and anybody that gets involved is doomed to fail. Of course, there are lots of examples where Afghanistan has not been the graveyard of an empire, but that there's a lack of willingness to pursue even the most tried and tested, century-old, cost-effective strategy to maintain peace. So what is the political impulse that drives the clamours for withdrawal? Well, a lot has been said about imperial nostalgia, that the only reason that we're staying in Afghanistan, the only reason that we engaged on that project, was because we believed falsely that the United States, the West, NATO, Britain, whatever, were imperial powers. But I think the belief in isolationism and the belief in withdrawal, the kind of Pat Buchanan, Republic not Empire type attitude, is more a form of imperial nostalgia than believing that you have to have an active part in the world. The belief that as a country you can simply withdraw strategically and economically is a form of imperial nostalgia. It is a belief that the United Kingdom or the United States can simply withdraw into its shell and be protected from the world and be self-sufficient. We don't live in that world. I'm sorry, we don't. We can even take some, for instance, recent inflation being caused partly by caused entirely by supply side issues such as the shortage of semiconductors and timber. We live in a globalized world, whether we like it or not, which was one of the most relevant and perceptive speeches given by Tony Blair, ironically enough, which was that we all live in this world and we have to try to navigate it. And unless we have some form of total revolution, some sort of total transfiguration of the international forms of financial and economic relations, that is always going to be the case. And something as simple as a moderate cost of intervening in a country in order to make it stable, stable to have the imports of your nation's goods, stable as a strategic stronghold against perhaps your international competitors, that the idea that we don't need to do that we actually don't need to project influence and we don't need to project power, is to say that we already have the power within our country as it stands. That the UK or the US is already strident and powerful enough. It doesn't need to project power in the world. That all we're doing in the world is a form of charity. Indeed, that anything that we do in the world is not in our own interests at all, not in the interests of, say, even the finance capitalists of the country at all, but part of this ideological moral crusade. And so the second lesson of history about the graveyard of empires is definitely there, but I think it's better to turn to Africa than it is to turn to the Middle East. That in the unwinding of the British Empire in the 19th century, you had missionaries and liberals going off to Africa to teach the heathen Christianity. And this comes into Kipling's idea of white man's burden. That this idea that the empire was not actually a strategic benefit, that it wasn't an economic cost, and Keynes wrote a pamphlet about how decolonisation would be better for Britain than having the colonies, which of course didn't turn out the way he intended. But the idea that we don't need these colonies and we don't need to project imperial power is itself the assertion that we already are powerful enough on our own. And I think this whole debacle has shown that it's not the case. Certainly for the UK. We thought we'd leave the European Union, we'd leave this coalition of European allies, and now what's happened? Our main supposed ally post-Brexit, the United States, has not even informed us of withdrawing its troops overnight. And already the headlines are talking about this being another Dunkirk. Yeah, of course. World War II nostalgia has to come out. Boomers have to have it. They have to have their World War II nostalgia. Okay, so it's another Dunkirk, Britain alone, Britain standing alone. And you think this isn't supposed to be what the post-Brexit settlement would turn out to be. It wasn't supposed to be Britain standing alone. It was supposed to be Britain connecting with its former allies. Australia has revealed itself to be a country that is totally beyond the imaginations of people in the UK. I think the way that they deal with COVID and lockdown and their domestic policy has opened the eyes of many people to the realities of any kind of, quote, commonwealth or, what they call it, Anne's Cuck, something like that, isn't it? Anne's Cuck Union, the Cuck Union between the UK and Canada and Australia. Really? You think that's going to happen when almost all of Australia's economy is dependent on the export of raw materials to China? When Australian politicians have openly been bribed by Chinese politicians? You think that's going to happen? Or Canada? You think that's, with its immense ties to the US, do you think they're going to give that up to, shackle themselves to Boris Johnson's government? Really? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. What's happening is that the special relationship in this global Britain is proving itself to be a complete farce. And so we're having to retreat into these fantasies that Britain can stand on its own and be this sort of North Korea in the North Atlantic, which in some ways would be preferable to what we have now. But putting that aside, we have a situation now where, ironically, the very allies in Europe that we turned our back on, and I did vote to leave, of course, I'm not some kind of Remainer, but the very allies that we turned our back on in Europe are now the ones that we're going to have to go crawling back to in order to project any kind of influence, particularly the French. And now the same Brexiteers that told us that we were going to be shacking up to the Americans are telling us that, oh, the special relationship's dead, we're going to have some kind of Anglo-French alliance. And you can see the nonsense of it. That I've always said, I've said for years and years, that America isn't our friend. You know, and this is a strand that goes through the right. I mean, you even go back to, say, someone like Alain de Benoit, who said that he would rather have communist tanks rolling over France than American McDonald's and blue jeans and whatever. And I think there's an element of truth in that America is an unreliable ally. It's proven itself to be unreliable. And it views us as Orwell wrote Airstrip 1, right? You know, they use our military. They fucking chuck, effectively. And I think it's very funny that this is all happening. And I think the lesson of history of this is that, okay, we might be in a twilight of our empire. I think twilight is probably too optimistic. I think it's over. I mean, you could say British Empire is a historical entity now that's being deconstructed. You know, the very empire itself is being deconstructed, which demonstrates the fact that it's simply a relic of history at this point. But sort of imperial irredentism doesn't find itself in pragmatic interventions and interactions with the outside world, which any medium-sized country needs to do. It forms itself around this sort of liberal arrogance that we can exist as a nation unto ourselves without interacting with the world because we are so powerful and because we are so imperialistic. So the two lessons: the first, that a very small and cost-effective force can be used to police an unstable region. That's a lesson. And the second lesson is that actually isolationism and the idea that we should just pull out entirely and the Afghan, Taliban are based and whatever, that's a kind of form of imperial arrogance and a form of delusion, just like the Kan-Kuk or Az-Kuk or whatever they want to call themselves think, that we can restore the Commonwealth and Britain can stand alone. Britain can't stand alone. It never did, and it never will. But I know you're probably going to turn off, saying, "Oh, this is terrible. This guy is an absolute, traitor." Yeah, well, I'm just saying the reality of the fact is that we're going to have to form new alliances and new formations of power. And the European Union, I think, had the potential to do something good. It's obviously not. It has so many of its own problems, and it's mainly because it gives member states too much power. That's a video for another topic for another video. But I think the reality is going to face people in the UK that this sort of old 20th century form of being a vassal to America is not going to sustain ourselves. We can't. And what the government wants to do is become a vassal to China and sell off all our assets. I mean, thank God the spooks stepped in. I don't like the spooks at all. But when Johnson's establishment were planning to sell all of our 5G infrastructure to Huawei and to Chinese state-run companies, Spook stepped in and said, look, you do realise this is going to have really severe security concerns going ahead for the next 10 years. And the government went, oh yeah, maybe, oh yeah, probably. It's totally mad. It's absolutely mad. So we're in a situation where either we sell out to the US, we sell out to the Chinese, or we integrate ourselves into this wishy-washy, insubstantial rump parliament, which is the EU. And but the alternative to that isn't to be isolationist. It's not to say, I see all of these options, US, China vassalhood or tributary system, EU integration, and I don't like any of them, and so I want to be isolationist. What I'm saying is that we're going to have to face the reality that going ahead in the next 20 years, next 50 years, we're going to have to form new alliances and new power blocks. And this could be an Anglo-French power bloc in the Atlantic. It could be reaching out to other countries in the world. And unfortunately, this is the reality. This is what we're going to have to deal with. So it's pessimistic, I suppose. I'm not pro-Afghan, but I'm anti-Afghan withdrawal. I think this will make me slightly unpopular, but it's just my 2 cents. I thought you'd be interested in it. There will be more Bowden content coming, but I just thought I'd give you my 2 cents on this. Okay, thanks for listening, guys.